Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for the courtesy that the Honourable the Speaker wanted to extend the entirety of the House, but I am, for my part, prepared to reply to the Chief Minister now. Mr. Speaker, it's an honour for me to deliver to this House my fourth budget speech as Leader of the Opposition and my ninth budget speech overall. Unhappily, Mr. Speaker, this year we find ourselves debating these estimates of revenue and expenditure against the backdrop of a Brexit vote at the referendum and potentially the single largest threat to our economic model since the closure of the frontier and, in my view, in the history of democratic government in Gibraltar. While on this side of the House we have every faith in the ability of our community to overcome adversity, it is important that this debate takes place within a framework of sober analysis, prudence, and realism. We are, after all, debating what the government, for example, has spent and what it intends to spend, the way the government intends to fund that spending, the size of our reserves and public debt today and also into the future. That debate must also, above all, take place in the context of a probable Brexit and the uncertainties that Gibraltar currently faces. No one wants, Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom to leave the EU, but our economic contingency plans must proceed on the basis that Brexit is not only possible, but as is indeed probable. Our economic model is one that is based largely on the ability of commercial entities to passport their goods and services into the European Union. It is a model that we have spent many decades developing and selling to customers. It is a model that we must do everything that we can to protect. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, in this context, I remind the House that both the Chief Minister and myself, during the course of the referendum debate, were both of the view that a vote to Brexit the European Union was a vote that placed an existential threat over that model that we have relied upon for the last 3 decades. The financial services sector that is built on those foundations provides over 4,643 jobs on the last figures that we have. And in this context, I'm very grateful to the Honourable the Minister for Employment to have provided me with an advanced copy of the employment survey. The tourist sector, that also benefits from free movement of people, provides many thousands of jobs. The hotel and restaurant sector alone accounts for 1,763 jobs. Nearly 2 million people visited Gibraltar last year through our EU border. Over many decades, we have sold investment into Gibraltar by emphasizing an attractive lifestyle, a job and a home in Gibraltar, a second home or easy access to Spain. The gambling and betting activity sector, where those are real factors, employs 3,205 people. Behind those numbers, of course, there are real people and real families, and it's for the sake of those real people and those real families that we must ensure that no stone is left unturned in our attempts to protect them in this situation. And of course, Mr. Speaker, each sector of the economy is not hermetically sealed from the next. The success of the private rental and home ownership sector is directly linked to the success of, amongst others, the financial services and the gaming sector. The ability of the government through tax revenue to continue to provide year-on-year increases in health and in our caring services is also dependent on those jobs. Less jobs, less revenue, less expenditure. It's a simple formula, Mr. Speaker. In March 2012, our expenditure on health was £75 million. £75 million. In this budget, expenditure on health has increased this year, according to the forecast outturn, to £107.2 million. That represents an increase, Mr. Speaker, of 43% over the last 4 years. Everyone wants the best possible health and caring services. But to do that, we must continue to prosper as we have done over the last 3 decades. When I make that analysis of jobs, expenditure, and revenue, I'm also mindful of the fact that at a macroeconomic level, half of our GDP is accounted for by jobs in our economy. At the end of March 2015, there were 26,144 jobs in the economy, a rise of 7.1% since March 2014. Much of that rise is in construction, but it feeds directly and indirectly into economic growth, and therefore the Honourable, the Father of the House, is right to be cautious in terms of GDP projections in the uncertain world that we live post the Brexit referendum. Gibraltar's size and ability and agility, I beg your pardon, makes us able to react to events quickly. And that is a huge advantage at this time. But our dependence on certain sectors and a particular economic model, together with growth based on public spending, may make us significantly susceptible to a downturn. It's one of the reasons the Honourable Gentleman and I, indeed, were concerned about a possible Brexit vote. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, for all my criticisms of the government about spending and public debt over the last 4 years, it's my duty to steer a careful line between honest assessment in the public interest with the need to maintain confidence and to work with the government in order to attempt to steer Gibraltar into calmer waters. To do otherwise would constitute a dereliction of duty, and it's not what I'm in politics for. The quid pro quo, however, has to be that those dealings with the government must be based on an open, transparent, and non-partisan basis, where initiatives on the future of Gibraltar are not made unilaterally by the government. Future generations of Gibraltarians will not forgive the Honourable Gentleman, as indeed will not forgive me, if we were to place party before country in this situation. It is therefore a difficult budget speech that I deliver today, balancing as I must objective observation of the state of public finances, which is my principal duty after all to this House, against a very difficult backdrop indeed. We cannot, however, divorce this debate from reality. Mr. Speaker, in my view, our focus as a nation has to be retention of confidence in the market here in Gibraltar and retention of existing clients. Early public assurances from the United Kingdom government that it will be immovable in ensuring Gibraltar's access to the single market must be the priority goal. Even this, I accept, is easier said than done, but it must still be a priority. The proponents of the Leave campaign held different views about UK access to the single market. The announcement that there is to be significant internal reflection and discussion in the United Kingdom to decide some of these issues before any notice is provided to the Council of Europe under Article 50 is to be welcome. That will give us time to express our views and to lobby intensely. Lobbying that I would expect would be undertaken on a joint basis between the government and the opposition. If an Article 50 notice can be avoided by the United Kingdom staying a member of the EU and England and Wales opting out in a Denmark-Greenland type situation, all the better. I can of course foresee constitutional and significant political problems with the latter, but we must accept that the government is entitled to leave no stone unturned in this situation. There are other options, Mr. Speaker, that we have discussed and will remain confidential between us until the appropriate juncture. In my view, however, we must plan on the basis that at some stage an Article 50 notice will be delivered by the UK government to the European Council. We therefore have to be prepared for that eventuality. That notice, Mr. Speaker, will trigger a 2-year negotiating period where the UK will negotiate terms of exit with the EU, including any access to the single market. We need to use all the time that we have, mobilizing our friends in the United Kingdom and obtaining assurances from the political protagonists of the future that any access the United Kingdom obtains to the single market will be extended to Gibraltar. Mr. Speaker, in this regard, of course, the Foreign Minister of Spain, Señor García Margallo, has on a number of occasions reiterated that Spain will not agree access for the United Kingdom to the single market with the inclusion of Gibraltar. We are going, Mr. Speaker, to demonstrate to Señor García Margallo what it is to have resolve, what it is to have unity in this community, and what it is to show determination as a people, Mr. Speaker. But it is important to emphasize that timing is all important. My understanding is that Spain has no right to veto any terms of access between the UK and other member states. What Spain can veto is an extension of the 2-year negotiating period. Provided that agreement is reached within a period of 2 years after Article 50 notice is delivered, Spain will not be able to veto an agreement reached by the UK government with the rest of the EU, including an agreement in respect of Gibraltar. That is why, Mr. Speaker, early intervention is absolutely critical on our part. The leaders of the Leave campaign also spoke about the UK negotiating deals with third parties. At the moment, the EU has 50 such trade deals with third parties. Those and any other trade deals should be extended to Gibraltar as and when they are negotiated by the United Kingdom. Our gaming and insurance sectors have also faced recent challenges arising from decisions taken by the UK government. Changes to the VAT regime, the point of consumption tax are some of those challenges. In the situation that we find ourselves today, caused entirely by the UK government decision to hold a referendum, the UK government has to rethink these policies as they affect Gibraltar. And in this respect, Mr. Speaker, I therefore look forward to the speech that the Honourable Gentleman, the Minister for Financial Services, Mr. Isola, will be delivering in due course. And in my opinion, Mr. Speaker, in tandem with all that, we need to work very closely with stakeholders, opening or expanding into areas that are less susceptible to EU challenges that we face. These are some, Mr. Speaker, areas that we need to focus, in my opinion, but undoubtedly there are others. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Chief Minister said last week that it was business as usual. The very fact that we are holding this budget debate today shows that as far as government and opposition and the respective roles that we have been elected by this community to perform, it is business as usual. But the Chief Minister also said that it was business as usual in terms of the government's adherence to its manifesto commitments. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman cannot, in my respectful view, run with the hares and hunt with the hounds. Yesterday, in giving a taster of the budget measures that he was proposing to introduce or hoping to introduce at this session, he said that the government had to rein in on spending. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more with that statement. However, there is absolutely nothing that he has said today that indicates to me that the government is serious about its intentions to rein in on spending. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, he has said nothing at all about how much money the government intends to raise through some of the measures that he is proposing to introduce today. or has outlined today, and has not indicated to this House, as would have been usual, particularly in the situation that we find ourselves today, how much some of the measures that he is proposing to introduce will cost the government in the years and in the year that is going to follow, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman has said during the course of his intervention that he is proud of the government's spending. Mr. Speaker, of course a government is going to be proud of its spending, but spending per se is neither here nor there. It's about priorities in spending, Mr. Speaker, and it's also long-term consequences of that spending. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman and I are not going to be judged by future generations on the moment. We're not going to be judged on this budget. We're not going to be judged for how loudly Honourable Gentleman opposite bang on the table every time the Honourable Gentleman makes a good point, or indeed bang on the table, the gentleman on this side of the House, bang on the table, hopefully, Mr. Speaker, absolutely, hopefully, when I finish my speech, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman and I will be judged by future generations on consequence about spiralling and increases in recurrent expenditure, as I will develop in due course, consequences about carrying the debt that we are currently carrying. And there is nothing, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable Gentleman has said in his budget address that certainly allays my concerns, and that indicates to me that the Honourable Gentleman's mindset has changed, particularly in the light of that probable Brexit. In the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, we have already seen how its credit rating has been downgraded, and there has been huge market volatility and uncertainty. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, made a robust, optimistic and positive speech at the Treasury last Monday, emphasising that Britain has one of the strongest major advanced economies in the world, and that as a result the British economy was about as strong as it could be to confront the challenges Britain now faced. The very next day, in an interview with the BBC, he said that the UK government had to show it could live within its means, and that tax rises and spending cuts were almost inevitable. Last week, the Honourable the Father of the House said that Brexit was potentially the most serious crisis to hit the world since the 1930s. I certainly agree with him as far as the seriousness of the potential crisis to Gibraltar. In the context of a probable Brexit and the uncertainty that we will face over the next 2 years, the government cannot expect to continue spending money at the rate that it has been spending, and it cannot be business as usual as far as their manifesto commitments are concerned. Their manifesto, Mr. Speaker, will cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds in the context of the fact that they have already spent £750 million in capital projects over the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker. Our discourse over those years has been that the government was spending too much money, funded by too much debt, part of which was being kept away from proper parliamentary scrutiny in government-owned companies. But we were also saying that that was not only imprudent at the best of times, but less so when there were potentially difficult times ahead for Gibraltar. In my 2014 speech that I delivered to the Chamber of Commerce on the budget that the Honourable Gentleman had just recently then delivered, I identified and listed a potential Brexit as one of those potential curves up ahead for this community. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is something that the government ought to have been factoring into the equation of its public spending both in terms of recurrent expenditure and also expenditure on capital projects over the last 4 years. Because however improbable we all thought that a Brexit was likely to be, it was nonetheless possible. And to have spent money, Mr. Speaker, in the way that the government has spent money over the last 4 years is not, in our view, prudent or reasonable. And there is nothing, Mr. Speaker, absolutely nothing unpatriotic about my criticisms of the government in this respect. I am no less of a Gibraltarian as the honourable gentleman is, simply, Mr. Speaker, because I have, and this side of the House, we all hold a different view, Mr. Speaker, about how Gibraltar can be kept safe and secure in the light of the challenges that this community faces, Mr. Speaker. But I will say this. I agree with the honourable gentleman that if there was ever a time for a return to the rainy day fund policy of the early 1990s, it is today. And I would hope, Mr. Speaker, over the next year and indeed in years to come, that the honourable gentleman opposite pay much more attention to the honourable, the Father of the House, and his voice of caution, than they have obviously done over the last 4 years. And Mr. Speaker, there is no point, and I heard the honourable gentleman saying, no se ha enterado. Yes, I do get it, Mr. Speaker. I do get it. It's just I don't agree with the honourable gentleman that the money in community care is a rainy day fund for the entirety of this community. And it is self-evident, Mr. Speaker, that it is not so. Because the money in community care, which is a money owned by a charity of Gibraltar for the benefit of a sector of our community, is not money that is going to be available, Mr. Speaker, for the government and for the general community if things were not to go as well as we all hope that it's going to be going over the next 4 years. Mr. Speaker, and I want to illustrate some of these issues by reference to increases in recurrent expenditure compared to recurrent revenue, together with decreases in cash reserves. Mr. Speaker, on the 31st of March 2012, the overall recurrent departmental expenditure stood at £332.7 million, whilst the forecast outturn this year stands at £453.1 million. In other words, it has risen just simply on the estimates of revenue and expenditure, which we're debating, by 36.1% since March 2012. That is a very significant increase in 4 years, and it still underestimates, increases in recurrent expenditure for reasons that I'm going to be developing in a moment. Next year, it is expected to rise by 40% from the position it was in March 2012 to £461.1 million. Mr. Speaker, but that in itself does not provide us, as I alluded to a few moments ago, with a full picture. As I have noted in previous years, the comparison between March 2012 and March 2016 is not comparing like with like. Prior to financial year ending March 2014, contributions to community care were treated as an expense through a contribution to the Social Security Fund. Since 2014, these amounts have not been treated as an expense and have been included in the surplus, and then from there it has been paid to community care. In other words, Mr. Speaker, prior to 2014, the contributions to community care were treated as an expense above the line. Subsequent to 2014, it's been treated as an expense below the line. The effect in accounting terms is to lower expenditure and to increase the surplus by a corresponding amount. This year, that would have meant an increase in recurrent expenditure of £20 million and a decrease in the surplus by that amount. If you compare like with like, recurrent departmental expenditure based on these estimates that we're debating today have increased by 42.2% since 2012. But Mr. Speaker, none of this, of course, takes into account the huge elephant in the room. That is Credit Finance Company Limited and Gibraltar Investment Holdings Limited. Because there is absolutely no point, Mr. Speaker, to talk and to pat ourselves in the back about a surplus of £38.8 million when the government has caused the Gibraltar Savings Bank to invest £400 million in Credit Finance Company Limited, and that company is then spending tens of millions of pounds on payment, for example, of the commuted pensions of civil servants, Mr. Speaker. The commuted pensions of civil servants has traditionally been an expense of the government, and now it is an expense of Credit Finance Company Limited. The effect, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work this out, is that, of course, the government does not have to pay that money directly itself to pay for the commuted pensions of civil servants, which is a jolly good idea, Mr. Speaker. I'm not criticizing it. But it doesn't, but Mr. Speaker, the government does not pay for it itself. It's paid for by Credit Finance Company Limited, meaning that the government has more money in these estimates of revenue and expenditure available to it. But Mr. Speaker, more than £300 million from Credit Finance Company Limited has also been paid to Gibraltar Investment Holdings Limited, which is the company at the top of the pyramid of all government-owned companies, and that money is seeping down through government-owned companies, and it's being used, to quote the Honourable the Father of the House, who in fairness to him has always been straight with this House in relation to this particular issue, to fund the cash flow requirements of those government-owned companies, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when the Honourable Gentleman, for example, as he did today, speaks about the change in accounting practice and the fact that the government is now funding government-owned companies to the tune of £25 million, what he doesn't say to this House, or what he doesn't accept, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that Gibraltar Investment Holdings Limited is receiving hundreds of millions of pounds of savers' money, which it is then using in order to fund those government-owned companies. If that happens through credit finance, Mr. Speaker, then of course the government does not have to itself put its money in its pocket and use the money that it has set out in its estimates of revenue and expenditure. And again, Mr. Speaker, it distorts expenditure of the government by creating a picture that is, of course, healthier, Mr. Speaker, than in reality it is. Because every debt, and let's call it, whether we call it investment, we call it anything else, has to, at some stage, be repaid, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my view, with or without the expenditure by Credit Finance Company Limited, these are very significant increases in recurrent expenditure, and I remain as concerned today as I have been over the last few years. More so, of course, in the climate that we find ourselves in. When we compare this long-term trend in increases in recurrent expenditure with long-term trends in increases in recurrent revenue, debt, and decreases in cash reserves, we can see that that concern is entirely justified. In March 2012, recurrent revenue, stood at £454 million. Recurrent departmental expenditure, as we have seen, was £332.7 million. Recurrent departmental revenue therefore stood at 73.2% of recurrent expenditure. Recurrent revenue today stands at £581.5 million, and recurrent departmental expenditure has a forecast outturn of 453.1 million. To that, we have to add the £20 million to community care, which now the government is treating below the line, when prior to 2014 it was treating above the line. Recurrent departmental expenditure today is therefore currently running, if we are to compare like with like, March 2012 to March 2016, at 81.3% of recurrent revenue, and that does not take into account, Mr. Speaker, the expenditure that is not being accounted for in these estimates of revenue and expenditure, but that is being channeled through Credit Finance Company Limited with the monies from the Gibraltar Savings Bank. Moreover, whilst recurrent departmental expenditure has increased by 42.2% since 2012, if we use my figure, or 36.1% if we use the Honourable Gentleman's figure, recurrent revenue has increased by 28%, Mr. Speaker. For 3 years, I have been warning about this convergence between recurrent revenue and recurrent departmental expenditure. Last year, I called it a worrying trend. It is a trend that we need to reverse, more so post the referendum result. Mr. Speaker, in my analysis at the beginning of my speech, I said that segments of the economy cannot be hermetically sealed from other segments or sectors. Contraction in one sector would have a knock-on effect on others and on the size of the economy generally, and of course, on revenue. In this regard, input duty is actually down this year from 160 million to 151.5 million. The convergence that I have spoken about between recurrent revenue and expenditure would have been much narrower had it not been for an increase in revenue of 20.4 million in corporate tax and 5.5 million in personal tax. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we know from last week's answers to questions that the government owes personal taxpayers 19.5 million and also corporate taxpayers 10.1 million in tax rebates. If that had been paid, the trend towards convergence between recurrent revenue and expenditure would have been much closer, and it would have, of course, virtually wiped out the surplus. Mr. Speaker, in making that analysis, however, I do want to congratulate the Financial Secretary and indeed the Father of the House. Leaving aside Credit Finance Company Limited, and as I have said, it's a massive, massive elephant in the room because it distorts much of what the government is spending in a downwards trend. In the year ending 2014, the government had overspent by £40 million. Last year, it had overspent by nearly £28 million. This year, Mr. Speaker, it has not overspent, and I am happy to recognise that fact, and as I have said, congratulate the Father of the House and also the Financial Secretary in this regard. I would also like to think, I know that there is a look of shock on the face, Mr. Speaker, of the Honourable the Father of the House, but I would like to think that our job as an opposition in holding the government to account in this area has played a small but perhaps effective role in pushing the government into achieving that particular target. Mr. Speaker, recurrent expenditure is not the entirety of the government's expenditure, of course. It does not take into account capital projects, that £750 million that we say they spent over the last 4 years. The government would say that this is money well spent, investments as they would call it, but it's money spent nonetheless. And we can see the effect of that spending and that rise in recurrent expenditure that I have outlined during the course of my speech on debt and also on cash reserves. On the 31st of March 2011, cash reserves stood at £273.8 million. On the 31st of March 2012, cash reserves, and that's the first budget that the Honourable Gentleman delivered before this House, cash reserves that dropped but still stood at a very healthy £213.9 million. From then on, cash reserves have dropped significantly to 73.2 million last year in March 2015, and the forecast outturn for this year is 100.3 million pounds. Mr. Speaker, that represents a downturn in the cash reserves available to this government and this community of 53% since March of 2012, Mr. Speaker. The increase in recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure over the last 4-year term also explains why direct and indirect public debt has increased exponentially since the Honourable Gentleman opposite came into office. In March 2011, net debt stood at 206.36 million. By March 2012, it had increased to 303.72 million. And by the end of December last year, it stood at 418 million pounds, Mr. Speaker. That is less than 30 million from the then legal borrowing limit of 447 million pounds. Today, as per the forecast outturn, net debt stands at 345 million. That level is still, Mr. Speaker, higher than the government's targets at the election of 314 million pounds for this year. And I expect, Mr. Speaker, that net debt is going to continue to increase substantially over the next year and over the next few years. Indeed, just as at the beginning of last year, before last year's budget session, net debt stood at 400 million and above, and it was reduced for the purposes of the budget debate, but started to increase very rapidly thereafter, so too will we see the same pattern this year. And the reason is very simple. Every year before the budget debate, there is a tightening of the belt. Less bills are paid during the period, producing a temporary increase in cash reserves. After the budget, there is a loosening of the belt, cash reserves decrease, and net debt then suddenly starts increasing. We do not have the figures for April and May because the Honourable, the Father of the House, last year told us that he was not providing those figures because it would feature in the speech that was going to be delivered by the Honourable the Chief Minister. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, just as we predicted last week, that has not been the case. But I know, Mr. Speaker, as well as the Honourable Father of the House, that net debt and the trend in net debt is only going in one direction, unfortunately, and that is upwards. Mr. Speaker, the long-term trend is clear. Very significant increases in recurrent expenditure over the last 4 years, recurrent revenue increasing at a slower rate than expenditure in percentage terms, very significant reductions in reserves, and very significant increases in net debt. And of course, that does not take into account of the elephant in the room, Credit Finance Company Limited. This, of course, Mr. Speaker, posed an insoluble problem for the government over the last 4 years. Not only had it promised £750 million of capital projects to the electorate in 2011, but it had also promised, which is delivering, to donate all surpluses to community care, and had criticised the level of debt under the GSD government as an addiction to debt. And of course, because of the legal borrowing limits at the time, it was also legally impossible for the government to directly borrow sufficient money in order to pay for all those promises that it made in 2011. That is the reason why, Mr. Speaker, in our view, £400 million of debentures from the Gibraltar Savings Bank was, to use their term, invested in Credit Finance Company Limited, which in turn, as I have alluded to during the course of my speech, is being used in order to pay for government expenditure. The gross debt of this community is not £446 million in the forecast outturn. It is £418 46 million if you simply take into account the monies invested in Credit Finance Company Limited, or 885 million pounds if the government had to make good all those so-called investments made by the Gibraltar Savings Bank in government-owned companies. Prudent management, Mr. Speaker, of our public finances needs to take account of this global picture. We cannot collectively, Mr. Speaker, bury our heads in the sand and pretend that Credit Finance Company Limited does not exist and pretend that the government is not using it in order to pay for government expenditure. Mr. Speaker, many countries in Europe calculate and compute public debt by taking into account PFI arrangements and indeed the debts of government-owned companies. That is the position in the United Kingdom, and that is the position that we are urging from this side of the House for the government to adopt. And Mr. Speaker, it's not just about openness and transparency or the quality of our democracy. It's also about the ability of the opposition to identify potential financial problems if they arise. And this is even more important, Mr. Speaker, this year than it was last year, Mr. Speaker. None of this, of course, takes into account the way that the government is going to be funding the power station, or indeed the money that the government is now going to be expending in relation to the tunnel under the runway. And we reserve our judgment until we look at the detail of that to see what effect it might have on the public finances, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this year the government changed the way the legal borrowing limits were calculated, and there was a sense of déjà vu, Mr. Speaker, in the way that the government did so. During the 2011 election, the honourable gentleman opposite said nothing about their plans to use the Gibraltar Savings Bank in order to fund government expenditure and therefore, directly or indirectly, their manifesto commitments. In March 2012, barely 3 months after the 2011 election, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Chief Minister came to this House with a bill amending the Gibraltar Savings Bank in order to do away with the requirement that all the investments of the Gibraltar Savings Bank be made in cash or cash equivalents from the preservation of their capital value perspective. In other words, very liquid and very safe forms of investments. That change in the Gibraltar Savings Bank is what allowed the government to invest Gibraltar Savings Bank deposits in credit finance, which has allowed them in turn to pay for their expenditure. It could not have happened, Mr. Speaker, under a GSD government. During the 2015 general election, the government made promises running into hundreds of millions of pounds in their 2015 manifesto. It could not have paid for those promises by borrowing directly under the law as it stood then, which in simple terms had a net debt borrowing limit based on 80% of recurrent revenue. As I have already noted, debt was running, or net debt was running, very close to the legal borrowing limit. At one point, less than £30 million from that net debt calculation. Rather than just simply say to the people of Gibraltar that the GSLP Liberals were planning to change the way the legal borrowing limits were calculated and therefore borrow more, which they couldn't do because of those debt limits, they said nothing and changed the formula barely 3 months into their term in office. Now, Mr. Speaker, the effect of it is that the government can borrow 40% of GDP, i.e. the size of the economy. It can borrow much more than it did before and without being limited to 80% of recurrent revenue. The experiences in places like Bermuda shows that the decoupling of debt from recurrent revenue in a small jurisdiction is not prudent, Mr. Speaker. In a post-Brexit situation, I urge even more caution. I genuinely want the honourable gentleman to succeed in these difficult circumstances, and I genuinely believe that we can. The alternative does not bear thinking about. But if it is to do so, it really must start a period of serious consolidation. It must rein in public debt. It must rein in future public spending. And I also urge them to move towards greater transparency of the public finances by bringing onto the books of the government its off-balance sheet debt, which is a trend in the UK and in other democratic countries. New spending, Mr. Speaker, over the next few years has to be very carefully prioritised. There are many other examples where we believe, or there are many examples, Mr. Speaker, where we believe the government has not prioritised its spending. But this year, Mr. Speaker, I want my analysis to be just as serious and sober as other years, but without the point scoring that has characterised these debates for many years. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to economic growth. Mr. Speaker, the forecast gross domestic product for the financial year 2013-14 was 1.484 billion, and the GDP for 2014-15 was 1.64 billion. Today, the Chief Minister has said that economic growth for the year ending the 31st of March 2016 is forecast to rise to 1.77 billion. These figures, Mr. Speaker, are therefore good figures, and I congratulate the government on them. But that economic growth has been driven to a large extent by government projects, construction in particular, and we would say funded by government direct and indirect borrowing. I hope that the honourable gentleman is right, that the economy will continue to grow. Everyone in Gibraltar hopes that he is right, not least all those on this side of the House. Mr. Speaker, last year I said this about the East Side development, and I quote, "It is also fair to say we have been here before on the East Side development. The first GSLP government in the 1990s came very close to concluding a deal, and in 2005 the then Chief Minister Peter Caruana and the then Trade and Industry Minister Joe Holliday signed an agreement with the Reuben Brothers and Multiplex Construction Limited, Australia's largest construction company, and a leading property developer in the UK, for an investment in the East Side worth over £1 billion. Unfortunately, the economic slump post-2007 prevented that project from prospering. The GSD hopes in the national interest that this latest project prospers and wishes the government every success in this regard. Anything that creates real jobs and economic development in Gibraltar will be welcomed by the GSD." End quote. Mr. Speaker, this is not an easy project, and we accept that. But the government has made announcements in the past. It led people to believe that this was a done deal. When the Father of the House revealed it was far from a done deal in a debate with my honourable friend, Mr. Clinton, at the election, we understandably asked questions publicly about it. The response from Cameron Holdings the day before the election was to say that they were, quote, surprised and disappointed, end quote, by the GSD attitude, and that they were happy to confirm that they were finalising arrangements for the payment of the premium in respect of this development. We were, of course, merely reacting to the Father of the House and what he had said during the course of the debate. To date, we do not know whether this project is going to go ahead with this developer or with a different developer, and I believe, in the light of past public statements by the Honourable the Chief Minister and the government, we are entitled to know. Again, I hope the government succeeds in its endeavours in this regard. Mr. Speaker, in the final analysis, I believe that what we need is for the government to rethink its spending plans for the next few years in the light of the referendum vote. It is time for consolidation and long-term planning. Mr. Speaker, that in itself is nothing new, because we have been calling from this side of the House for consolidation and for the reining in of public spending for a number of years now. But it is incumbent on a government that professes to be reasonable and a government that professes to be prudent in the light of the potential consequences that I have outlined for our economic model of a Brexit from the EU, to make that prudence and make that reasonableness a reality. And in this context, I want to say this. The Honourable Gentleman said that he is proud of government spending. I am proud, Mr. Speaker, of the work that Her Majesty's government, Her Majesty's opposition has done over the last 3 years in continually highlighting how the government was spending too much money and how our debt was increasing to a levels that we believed, Mr. Speaker, was not prudent. Mr. Speaker, it is always easier to defend huge spending, which keeps an awful lot of people happy, than to take the contrary view in the public interest, which is that for the sake of our future generations and our children and our children's children, that we ought to be taking a different view, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at times over the last 3 years, I have felt like the man who wanted to kill Father Christmas, Mr. Speaker. Such was the nature of the Honourable Gentleman's largesse to the community at large. But it is a largesse, Mr. Speaker. It is a largesse that at some stage is going to have to be repaid, and in the current climate, I renew my cause, and I know that the Honourable the Father of the House will never agree with me publicly, but I hope will be making much the same points privately in Cabinet, that we really do need to rethink our spending over the next 4 years. It is a time for us all to reflect. I have been talking about the culture of entitlement and expectation in Gibraltar, which I felt we all collectively needed to tackle. How many of us in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, who have been government ministers, as I have been, have come across a situation where someone, in good faith, because it has to be said that people come to you in good faith, but they come to you and they say, I am asking you to please do X, Y, and Z for me, not because I'm asking you to do a favor for me, but because I am entitled to it. A mí me pertenece. Mr. Speaker, in the current climate, there is something more important than ourselves as individuals. There is a collective well-being of this community and the obligation to ensure that future generations enjoy the benefits that we have enjoyed. To do that, we must all be responsible in the demands that we impose on the state, particularly over the next couple of years. As I have said, a rethink of spending priorities is important. A rainy day fund is, in our view, desirable. I do not agree with the Honourable Gentleman that that is what the Honourable Gentleman opposite have put into operation. Consolidation means, of course, completion, for example, of works at Glasses, Laguna and Moorish Castle and priority projects. But it also means a pause on substantial increases in spending, in particular recurrent expenditure and debt, until we have a clearer picture of what the future holds. And it also means, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend, the Honourable Mr. Clinton, will outline during the course of his speech, a realistic programme for repayment of that very significant direct and indirect debt that is owed by this community. The Honourable Gentleman finds himself steering a ship in waters and weather that might seem calm for now, but which have the propensity to develop into the perfect storm. He can rely on me to help in any way that I can, but we cannot proceed on the basis of manifesto promises that were made pre-referendum, Mr. Speaker. The rules of the game have changed, and it is now time, Mr. Speaker, for no further gambles, Mr. Speaker. And before I sit down, I too, Mr. Speaker, want to thank the job that the Honourable, the Clerk of the House has done, and his team, not only during the course of the referendum, but during the course of the last year. I want to thank Mr. Speaker as well for the patience in listening to what at times are, of course, heated debates across the floor of this House. I also want to add my voice to the Honourable, the Chief Minister's voice, in thanking Mr. Frank Carreras for the absolutely excellent work that he has done and for the service that he has rendered Gibraltar over the many, many years that he has served this community. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.